All right, so we start in an interesting place today. We rarely read from the Apocrypha on a Sunday morning, but the wisdom of Solomon is from the Apocrypha. So I will say a little bit about the Apocrypha. So you've got the Old Testament, and that action ends about 200 BC. And then you've got the New Testament, and the action in some ways begins early, but a lot of the letters are written later. But for Jewish folks, there's sort of a 400-year gap in there. And the Apocrypha covers that 400-year gap from 200 BC to about 200 AD. And what's interesting about the Wisdom of Solomon in particular is that it is written in Greek. It doesn't start in Hebrew like all these other ones did. It starts in Greek, and many scholars think it was the Jews who living in Alexandria, which is where? Egypt. Very good. That were passing on this spiritual wisdom. So as Episcopalians and as Christians, and we think of the Apocrypha, we think of the New Testament being up here. We think of equally the Old Testament being up here in terms of holiness and divinity, and we think of the Apocrypha in the middle being just below that. It's still important for us. It's still a spiritual guide in some ways, but we don't consider it the same Word of God that we would Exodus or Corinthians or whatever else it is. But occasionally, it makes it into our lectionary, and this is one of those times, the Wisdom of Solomon. Obviously, if it was written from Alexandria, it wasn't Solomon.
That's right.
Now, what you have is Solomon, who was David's son, about the year of 1000 BC, 950 or something like that. There's some things that get said in 2nd Chronicles and some things that get said in 1st Kings that we think the Wisdom of Solomon is then the leap of wisdom to that point. So as if you were reading back into a story, you know how we do these historic fiction kind of things. We go back in time. We're basing it on some good concrete stuff, but then the characters we choose, maybe Cold Mountain or I don't know, whatever else it is has to do with fictional people. So I'm not saying that this is fictional in that sense, but it is not truly Solomon who said these things.
Is it somewhat of a midrash?
It could be somewhat of a midrash, an interpretive expansion of what had been there. Yeah.
It's good.
It's good. It is good. If you go in and read the whole thing, I started reading chapters 1 and 2 because you can see this passage today is part of chapter 1 and a part of chapter 2. It's good. It's like reading Proverbs. It's like reading Psalms. It's like reading this thing. So it's offered in that same spirit that other wisdom literature has come in. So given that, Collins, how about if you don't mind? Oh, you're chewing. Sorry, I won't get you. How about Laura? You do it. Collins, I'll get you next time. Laura Black, if you would read the Wisdom of Solomon for us, please.
I'll do that. God did not make death. He does not delight in the death of the living, for he created all things so that they might exist. The generative forces of the world are wholesome, and there is no destructive poison in them. And the dominion of Hades is not on earth, for righteousness is immortal. God created us for incorruption and made us in the image of his own eternity. But through the devil's envy, death entered the world, and those who belong to his company experience it. Here ends the reading.
Thanks be to God.
Thank you. So you can see how this is tied to some very familiar Old Testament theology and story. In Genesis, we hear God say, let us make them in our image, in our image, let us make them. And then sometimes we think of image as in eyes, ears, arms, waste, whatever it would be. But this image is a little more in the sense of we're made in the image of eternity, in which we understand Adam and Eve were made in that way, not subject to death.
I was curious. I thought the devil's never mentioned in the Bible, just the regular Bible.
Oh yeah, no, Jesus, when he is tempted in the wilderness, it's Satan tempting him. I mean, it's right there. He's all over the place. So when Satan entered Judas, he's right there. So he's definitely there.
Still hanging around.
I think part of what you're talking about is how the devil is portrayed in the Old Testament. Job, you have Satan, who's almost like an angel conversing with God in heaven. So there's that little bit of a conversation. But this may actually, because this is later in Alexandria, the understanding of the devil may have grown to more of what we were used to in that part of the New Testament versus what we had in the Old Testament.
I stand corrected.
All right, that's okay. That's okay. I love just this language in verse 14. He created all things so that they might exist. The generative forces of the world are wholesome. And that is just a beautiful expanse about, the circle of life, that things are generated. At the same time, we know really there's as much death in the world as there is life. I'm not talking about human death and life, but trees live and die, bugs and animals live and die, stars live and die. I mean, everything, there's this cycle of life and death. So I have a hard time agreeing with the wisdom in the first line, God did not make death. I think God certainly, the things have been subject to death from the beginning when we look at it in that perspective. But I think this is saying more spiritually than biologically, is God created us to be with God in eternity. That God did not want us to be separated from God. And when we choose things like Adam and Eve chose, or Judas chose, and whatever we choose, we are actually choosing not to live. That's part of what sin is. We are using our free will to choose something other than life. Jesus said, I came that you might have life and have it abundantly. That abundance, that eternity, those kind of things come into discussion with that. Again, for righteousness is immortal. When we say, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, part of what we're saying is something about the immortality of God. And this immortality of life, that is a very positive thing, that God created us for incorruption. You can read that on two levels. One, the corruption of the body, or turning to worms, and all those things that Shakespeare says about what happens to our body. It disintegrates, it becomes corrupt. But then also the soul. The soul is obviously corruptible. The body is obviously corruptible, although God created us for incorruption. God created us so that those things wouldn't happen for us, even though if we make choices, they do. So there's a very interesting parallel that I was reading about today between this lesson and the gospel lesson, which we will get to later. Because Jesus is encountering two people who essentially are facing corruption of the body. The woman who's been hemorrhaging for so long, and the Jairus whose daughter is dying or is dead. And so part of what is happening in Jesus' ministry to those people is tied into this lesson about the power of God and immortality and life, where things had been subject to decay and death at one place or another. So that's just one thing I wanted to point out even before we get there. Any other?
I think Rob disappeared again. While Rob has disappeared, Laura, you're muted, so you can't. We can't read your lips, Laura. If you want to speak, you better.
I was just saying, oh no, he's gone again. Oh no, he's there. Yay.
Rob, we see your face, but we're not sure if we can, if you hear us or. Rob, you're still
He's
muted.
Rob is muted.
Yeah, you're skipping in and out. Now we can hear you. The question from the floor here is, what other books are in the Apocrypha? And I was about to read that list of ones in the Apocrypha. So Esther, Baruch, Bel the dragon, Ecclesiasticus, Esdras 1 and Esdras 2. Again, I said Esther, Jeremiah, the letter of Jeremiah, not the prophet Jeremiah, Judith, First Maccabees, Second Maccabees, Third Maccabees, Fourth Maccabees, the prayer of Manasseh, the prayer of Azariah, Psalm 151, because we only have 150 in ours, and the wisdom of Jesus, the son of Sirach, Song of the Three Young Men, or the Three Jews, as it's called, Susanna, Tobit, and this book, The Wisdom of Solomon.
That's a lot.
That's a lot.
Rob, I'd like to note that in this reading of Wisdom of Solomon, there's a reference to one of the devil's qualities. We don't really read a whole lot about the devil, but it's interesting that in the second to last line, it describes the devil's envy as the, if you will, the portal through which death entered the world. And I find that just kind of interesting that the writer chose to identify the devil as having envy, and that it was through that quality death entered the world.
Maybe that's again why it's one of the deadly sins, is that kind of envy. Yeah, good point. Question from the floor here, Bob.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking back on what you said on the Apocrypha, because I always like, you know, the gospel according to what Judas and Thomas and all those other things.
Right.
They didn't, the powers that be just didn't make it in. I never heard of a time frame that was outside of it, but just that for whatever reason, the Roman Catholic Church or whoever was finally putting all this together just didn't include that in our quote New Testament.
Well, there's even a nuance to that. It's the Jewish council that decided on these books. These are all Jewish books. None of these are Christian books in the Apocrypha. There's nothing about Jesus in that way.
But it's in that time frame, though.
It is in that time frame, as are all the Gospels and all the letters. So the writings that are happening there for Christians were actually solidified between 367 and 386. And that's when the Catholic Church, little c Catholic Universal Church, before there was a big Roman Catholic, when it was Constantine and the Holy Roman Empire and all that kind of thing, when the church finally said, listen, we got to decide if is the Gospel of Thomas in or out, is the Gospel of Mary Magdalene in or out, and they decided out and came up with what was in the New Testament. But
Was
even
that
before
Nicaea?
then, that was after Nicaea.
This was what?
It
After?
was after Nicaea, yeah. Nicaea was 331, 332, and this is 386, 387.
I
That
noticed
kind
that
of thing.
I have the New Standard Revised Bible, which I thought was the official Bible of the Episcopal Church, and it doesn't say anything at all about the Apocrypha.
Well, Not really, because I'm using the New Revised Standard NRSV, and it says with Apocrypha
Oh,
in it.
okay, it's maybe different edition.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So the Episcopal Church authorizes the Apocrypha for use in worship. There's authorization for worship. There's authorization for study. And then there are Bibles that don't contain them at all. And many denominations say ixnay on the Apocrypha.
What is their objection to it? They don't like what it says, or?
That it doesn't have the same degree of holiness as the New Testament and the Old Testament, that is not tried and true like those are. Like this one, the Wisdom of Solomon, it says Solomon, but if it's written in Greek, it obviously wasn't written by Solomon. It may have been written 1100 years after that, so it's falsely attributed to somebody. And so they don't want to include it because it seems like it's a stretch.
But that's true. A lot of, I mean, there are different sources that contribute to the Gospels, for instance, you know, the end source and all those things.
Right.
Right there. Very critical. People outside of just Matthew, Mark, Luke.
Right. But even as those were in the chain of bringing into being, by the year 90 or by the year 80, we had the Gospel of Matthew, and it was widely accepted and in use. Yeah.
If you eliminate it just due to it's probably not really written by Solomon because it's in the wrong language and all of that. You probably use similar arguments for many of those. Not from a language.
But it was written by Matthew, but it may not have been a firsthand account of Matthew. Matthew may have been bringing in some of those things of happening. So John would have written it, Mark would have written it, Paul would have written it, but it's not like this one where it's 1,000 years difference. And even some of the letters of Paul, people dispute in these same ways. That this sounds like it came after Paul's death, and it was somewhat in the realm of acceptability that a disciple of somebody would be able to write and do that. I mean, that's sort of what Mark did. If Mark never knew Jesus, we think, but he was writing about Jesus because he had heard Peter preach forever and ever, and he could tell all those stories. And so that's how and the same with Luke. Luke never having known Jesus personally, from what we understand. You're welcome. No, it's really important information to know about the Bible, how it came together, what we're putting our faith in, and what's behind it. And that it doesn't leave us with this blind faith in the spirituality, the faith, and the academics that go into the Bible and understanding really where it came from and those kind of things.
And one of the reasons that I really like the Episcopal Church.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That whole check your way in the door thing. What we're supposed to.
That's right. That's right.
Communicate.
That's right. That's right. And a little bit of questioning, a little bit of doubt, or some mystery is acceptable. And it's not just lockstep, we agree, and we're just moving ahead. Don't ask any questions, just move. I get you. That's exactly too why I love the Episcopal Church. All right, we're at the Psalm. And Rich, is Mary there with you? Can y'all read the Psalm for us, Psalm 30?
Mary had to leave. The gal is coming to help her clean up. Her car broke down, so Mary had to go get her. But anyway.
Okay, all right. Yes, we're not reading Lamentations. It's not part of it was either this or that. So we're doing Psalm over that.
Okay, Psalm 30. Do you want me to?
Yeah, why don't you just read it for us there, Rich, by yourself.
Okay.
Read it. We'll listen along.
I will exalt you, O Lord, because you have lifted me up and have not let my enemies triumph over me. O Lord, my God, I cried out to you, and you restored me to health. You brought me up, O Lord, from the dead, and you restored my life as I was going down to the grave. Sing to the Lord, you servants of his. Give thanks for the remembrance of his holiness. For his wrath endures but the twinkling of an eye, his favor for a lifetime. Weeping may spend the night, but joy comes in the morning. While I felt secure, I said, I shall never be disturbed. You, Lord, with your favor, made me as strong as the mountains. Then you hid your face, and I was filled with fear. I cried to you, O Lord. I pleaded with you, saying, what profit is there in my blood if I go down to the pit? Will the dust praise you or decline your faithfulness? Hear, O Lord, and have mercy upon me. O Lord, be my helper. You have turned my wailing into dancing. You have put off my sackcloth and clothed me with joy. Therefore my heart sings to you without ceasing. O Lord my God, I give you thanks forever.
Thank you. You can see through a brief reading of this why this psalm would have been paired with the same stories from the gospel that we're talking about. The woman who was healed of her hemorrhaging, Jairus and his daughter who were healed. You will not let my enemies triumph over me. The ultimate enemy, of course, being death. I cried out to you and you restored my health. And that's what's happening in that passage when we get to it. The woman cries out non-verbally, reaching out, grabbing his cloak. Jairus comes essentially storming through the crowd saying, help me, help me. And so crying out to the Lord is something that lepers do, that blind people do, that Zacchaeus, I mean, all this happens again and again and again. Have mercy on me. So what was been talked about in the Psalms and the wisdom is that God hears our prayer. Just like Murdoch was saying in his sermon last week, when he had the disciples in the boat, they appealed to him. Don't you care? Are you worried about us? And that's a cry too. And again, the enemy at that point being the storm did not have triumph. And because of that restoration in verse 4, the singing and the praise and all of that begins. I felt secure. I shall never be disturbed. But then all of a sudden, maybe I got too secure. And it felt like the Lord hid his face. Oh, you think you can make it on your own? Go ahead.
No way.
And then the guy says, oh, yeah, you're right. You are the one. But if you let me die, no one's going to be around to tell everybody how good you are. Don't you sort of like that rationale? You need me. You need me to praise. That's right. You need me to praise you. So don't, I'm sorry. The dust can't praise you, whatever else. Again, hear, O Lord, have mercy upon me. O Lord, be my helper. And I think that's just so much of the human condition, right?
Yeah.
O Lord, have mercy upon me. Be my helper. And the ways we ask God for help with our health, with our spiritual disciplines, with our patience, with our kindness, with our generosity, with whatever it is in our life, have mercy and help me. Again, that is a direct tie to the gospel passage for today. And again, giving thanks forever. If you're in the Colossians Bible study, you know that's one of the big themes, giving thanks, giving thanks, giving thanks. And this is also an important part of a little begin of a tie-in to the Corinthians passage, which is about a generous undertaking, which is a symbol of their thanksgiving. Any questions from the Zoom world or here on the floor or insights?
I like
Rob.
how they go from
Be right with you, Collins. Go ahead, Pam.
weeping to joy. They give you the balance, the back and forth with the example, and it ties into, God created us for living, not death.
Yes, and for joy. Yeah.
We all need to dance and Baptists would be so upset.
That's right. Collins, your
Yes.
turn.
Yes, on verse 10, the writer is basically presenting the argument about praising God, and you mentioned that, but there's a second portion too that the writer is saying, or declare your faithfulness. And I point out that one is vertical and the other is horizontal. In other words, praising is up to God, and declaring God's faithfulness is horizontal to other mankind. And I believe that's an encouragement for us to do both. while we still have
Yes.
breath of life, to not only praise, but declare. And it's not just declaring to God, oh God, thank you for your faithfulness. No, we are to share that good news with others, that God is faithful.
Yes, good point.
Thank you.
And that's why the cross is such a great symbol, because it has the vertical access and the horizontal access for this. Loving God, heart, soul, mind, and strength, loving your neighbor as yourself. I mean, it's just a great way to realize the connection from God to people, and then from people to people in the name of God. So that's a very good point. Thank you, Collins.
Well,
Any other insights? Any other questions? All right, Corinthians, 2 Corinthians. You remember part of our history at Good Shepherd here comes at the offertory when we say that God loves a cheerful giver, and the people chime in and say a cheerful giver. Well, that comes from this section, not this particular section, but what comes just after it, because Paul is trying to inspire them for a generous undertaking. He's taken up a collection. He's getting money, and he's taking it back to the Jerusalem church. And part of what's happening here, if you were looking at a map of the Mediterranean, there is an area, a region called Macedonia that includes some townships, Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, that are all New Testament cities that Paul traveled to. Corinth is in another region called Achaia, but it is also a city to itself. It is a port city, a very wealthy city, where some of these other cities may not have been quite as well off. But part of what he's doing here is saying, hey, this is the not so nice way to put it. Hey, these guys who don't have much money have given a lot. You guys who've got a lot of money, it's time. It's time. But he's also wanting them to do it voluntarily, freely. So he is saying not that this is God's command, but he's saying this is my advice, which is the case always when we choose to give, whether we're giving of our time, talent, and treasure. It is something that we do as a response to what God has done. And that's always the bigger picture that he's going to get into here. Remember that Jesus, who was in heaven, can he get richer than that? No, not in terms of gold, but in terms of that. He gave up his wealth and became impoverished, taking on our flesh, living down here in the world, so that we, in the world in our poverty, might know the riches of heaven. Jesus said, where your heart is, there your treasure will be also. And he's trying to point us to, as he said, do not build up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust consume, but treasures in heaven. So part of what Paul is doing here is getting them to understand all of these things. And just look how, let me tell you one other sort of academic thing before I mention this. Some people think these letters that we have, 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, are really part of 5 letters that were written to the Corinthians. The first letter has actually disappeared, because in what we call 1 Corinthians, Paul refers to my first letter, which we don't have. Then there is 1 Corinthians, which is probably the second one. Then there's 2 Corinthians, which might be in 2 parts. If you stand back and look at it, that they ended up here. They'll just put this one sounds like this one. We'll just put them together, and then another missing part. So this is a letter that he had. So one of the things that 5 letters tells us about the Corinthian church is this: Paul had a long and loving pastoral relationship with the church in Corinth. Sometimes, like to Colossae, the church, the other Bible letter we're reading, he probably never visited there, never had a personal relationship with them, and wrote to them only once, as far as we understand. The Romans, he had never visited Rome. The letter he sent to the Romans was an introduction of himself and his understanding to them. So when he got there, eventually they would understand and know who he is and that kind of thing. The church in Corinth was one that Paul started, one that Paul returned to physically, and one that he wrote to again and again and again. He had a deep care for the church in Corinth. And I think that's one of the reasons, as the scholars were saying, that he can write to them with more of an open heart, more of a personal appeal, because he really did have that kind of personal relationship with them. So one of the things that he wrote about in what we call 1 Corinthians 13, if I speak in the tongue of angels and have not love, I am what? A noisy gong or a clanging cymbal, right? If I have knowledge but have not love, nothing. And if I have faith, faith as if to move mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. Look what he's writing about here in verse 7. Now you excel in everything, faith and speech and knowledge, just like he had written to them in that other letter. He knows that they excel in some things. They excel in their faith, even to the point of trying to outdo each other in faith. They excel in their speech, even the sense that some probably go on and just love to hear themselves talk. And they excel in knowledge. That type of gathering wisdom is important to them. Essentially what he's saying is, I know you're people who like to excel, and I want you to excel in something else. Now, as you excel in everything, faith and speech and knowledge and utmost eagerness in our love for you, so we want you to excel also in this generous undertaking. Let's use your drive, your desire to be the best, to excel, to do good things. Now let's use that for this other thing. Now, I do not say this as a command, he says, but I am testing the genuineness of your love against the earnestness of others, the others being the Macedonians who had given. For you know, this is the big picture, the generous act of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes became poor, coming to earth, so that by his poverty you might become rich. Grace, love. Again, the true wealth of the father who had two sons was not the money he gave to his son that got spent in bad ways. The true wealth of the household was mercy and love and acceptance. That's what neither son really got, because they were still thinking of earthly wealth. And in this matter, I'm giving you my advice. It is appropriate for you, who began last year not only to do something, but to desire to do something. Sometimes we do it and it's out of obligation. Sometimes we do it and it's out of desire. So he's actually taking them a little bit deeper in life. You've desired to do this. You have said, hey, we've got these things. Why can't we share with them down in Jerusalem? They've committed themselves to prayer. It's a sign of our unity, all these things we're doing together. Finish now doing it, so that your eagerness may be matched by completing it according to your means. For if the eagerness is there, the gift is acceptable according to what one has, not according to what one does not have. I do not mean that there should be relief for others and pressure on you, but it is a question of a fair balance between your present abundance and their need, so that their abundance may be for your need, in order that there may be a fair balance. As it is written, the one who had much did not have too much, and the one who had little did not have too little. And that actually is a reference to Exodus chapter 16, verse 18, when Moses is talking about people going out to collect the bread of heaven. And some people had collected a whole lot, and some people hadn't collected a whole lot, but they had enough. Essentially, God is providing, but just let there be a fair balance to what you have.
So it's not enough just to have this. One must have action.
Action, that's right. And then the question becomes, for me, when I think about this, the one who had much did not have too much. Well, what is much and what is too much? What does that mean in our lives? If I were to look at my closet and think of the shirts I have in my closet, too much. And I start trying to get through them and pull them back, looking like, but I like those. Or the stuff we have in our houses. We start sorting through stuff. Where did all this come from? Why did I collect? This is just too much, which is one of the reasons our barn ministry actually helps us to do this kind of thing, right? Because we can pass it on and translates into very generous undertaking in our community.
That's right.
And the people who give their time to make that happen. So there are some things that we're doing, probably because most of us have too much.
Yeah.
We don't want to think about it that way, but we do. And in the whole world, we often focus in our lives about people who are up the ladder from us, but there are a lot more people on the ladder below us than on the ladder above us as Americans, just across the board. Even people who live at or below poverty in this country are still a whole lot wealthier and have more going for them than some other people in other countries. If you look at something as devastating as Haiti and how we try to, countries, people, whatever, try to give wealth, and sometimes it's taken and whatever else, because again, it's envy, it's greed, it's all those things that are part of our corruption, if you think about corruption. Bob.
There's a stat that I love. It says if your family earns $50,000 a year, you're in the top 1%
In the world.
1%.
Yeah.
1%.
Right.
So
We think about the 1% in this country, and it's not that number, but in the world, it is. That's right.
The point being is that you can no longer.
I think we lost him.
Rich, I think you're right.
Hey,
Are you back, Rob? Not yet. I'd like to note that I think Nike may have gotten its commercial from this 2 Corinthians letter. In the middle, Paul's encouraging the Corinthians to finish doing it, and Nike's commercial is just do it.
yeah. I wanted to comment. We were talking about Rob was talking about too much and not enough and sharing. I think the greatest gift we can give people is the ability to take care of themselves. If we open the doors and give them the tools, I think that when you give somebody something, that they appreciate it a little bit, but there's always a little resentment. But when you give them the ability to take care of themselves, Rob's muted.
What does it mean in our spiritual lives? And our money has spiritual significance on our souls and on our lives and the things we do. And how do we handle our abundance? The church, in its wisdom, says, all right, we're going to start with 10%. You make $50,000 a year, you give away 5, because that helps you from having too much. Now, people are making 50 saying, now, wait a minute. But what if you're making 200,000? What if you're making $500,000? You're giving away 50. That's one of the ways to not have too much, is to make sure you are giving it. Now, honestly, does that mean you give it all to the church? No. You give it to a hospital, you give it to a library, you give it to a school, you give it to some place that doesn't have too little. You know, we stomp our feet here in Jackson County saying our school's Blue Ridge School doesn't get enough, or we're all the tax base and it's getting redistributed down in Silva. Well, maybe there is too little in Silva where there is too much up here. Although there are people up here who live in the more than in the too little category than they live in the too much category. And how do we do all that? We're surrounded by, you know, wonderful clubs. We enjoy a beautiful place. We have, many of us, multiple homes. Maybe not even just 2, maybe 3. Is that too much? What's too much? And that's where it gets really uncomfortable.
Right.
That's where it gets really uncomfortable. Is what are we really called on to do with the abundance of what we have? And that's where it's just, okay, I'm not saying give it all, but you got too much. If you got plenty, think about passing it along to people who just don't have so much. And that's, again, through our outreach program, through these clubs that they have funds that they send money to play. I mean, they're actively working to do this from a moral basis, not even a spiritual basis. When High Hampton or Wade Hampton or Cedar Creek Club, whatever else, chooses to give money away, it may be from their members a spiritual thing, but for them, it's just a practical, moral. These people, you know, we can help. We're in a position to help, and we're going to help. And that's a good thing. And that's the same case that Paul is trying to make with the Corinthians, because sounds like they're in a pretty good place, almost to the point of, hey, y'all got too much. You got too much. So excel not in gaining and earning, but excel in giving.
Well, it's great that your heart's in the right place, but you need to have action.
Yes, that's right.
Right? I mean, he talks
Yeah.
a lot about you got all of this, but you
Yeah.
actually need to respond in action.
Right. And there's a lot of action. Prayer is action. Giving is action. Coming to church is action. Coming to study is action. All these things are active ways that we show and live into our faith. Again, that part of a prayer, not only with our lips, but in our lives. We do it with the things that we have.
Unto whom much is given, much is required.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. True.
Collins has something to say.
What other? Collins has his hand up. Yes, Collins.
Rob, you asked about what are we to do with our abundance, and no one in the room answered you, but I'd like to offer this as an answer. The first step to what we are to do with our abundance is to recognize it in a prayer of thanks to God for the abundance. And in that prayer of thanksgiving to God, we recognize that the abundance is a gift that we have received from God. And so I believe that a person will always be blocked from generosity if a person does not believe that the person has received the gift of what it is that the person has. And so I see the tie to thanks and giving and being given as the key to unlock the generous heart so that we can give abundantly.
Yes. And the spiritual tie-in there for Paul to the Corinthians is, think of Jesus, who had so much, but humbled himself and came to earth. And that really is the source. That's the big picture upon which we base all our decisions. That's sort of how firm a foundation. That's a foundational piece for us.
He said it was Thanksgiving and praise as the start. So what?
All right, Collins, if you don't mind, let's move on to Mark, and I'll have you read for us the Gospel of Mark, because I think we can hear you better through the computer than you can hear us through the computer speaker.
Mark 5:21 through 43. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at a point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him, and a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, for she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked around to see who had done it, but the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter's dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha, come," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. Thus ends the reading. The word of the Lord.
Thank you, Collins. So in this early sequence in the Gospel of Mark, we have had Jesus showing his power over wind and wave, like we did in last week's, and now over what seems to be incurable situations, health situations, this hemorrhaging and this death experience. And they seem to be people who are beyond hope, people beyond remedy in terms of earthly things. So on one level, we think about this when we're in that situation ourselves, people that we know of, why we pray, why we appeal to God, because we know that Jesus, the physician, has the opportunity to heal. Sometimes those prayers are answered to our hope. Obviously, they're not permanent because it might be 5 months or 5 years or whatever years later that the person, we're all going to die. But there is a healing that can happen. And again, the parallel to the wisdom of Solomon, that God's will is life. God's will is that we are not corruptible, that we are immortal, and that this show of strength and power is a way of connecting Jesus with God in those ways. Some other sort of thematic things that are interesting. Both Jairus and the woman had to push through the crowd. They had to get there to make that happen. There was some action on their part to go after this. And both of the times that's seen as an act of faith. Jairus is a leader of a synagogue, a Jewish person. Jesus was a Jewish person. This leader had known, maybe, is he risking his position to ask Jesus to do this? Is he going to be thrown out of a synagogue? Is he going to be said, well, you've lost that leadership position? This woman, who because of her hemorrhaging was considered unclean by Jewish situations, was an outsider. So you have someone who was probably the ultimate insider and someone who is essentially the ultimate outsider. Jesus does not distinguish between those two in his healing. This term that appears in verse 23 and later on in verse 28 and later on in verse 34, made well. Maybe some of your Bibles have the translation saved. When we use that terminology now about saved, have you been saved? Have you been made well? In the Greek, you can translate the word either way, saved or made well. So part of what we talk about is the healing that we all need. It may not be hemorrhaging, it may not be death, it may not be cancer, it may not be COVID, whatever else, but there is a sense of being made well that is important. And the other thing Jesus says to her, which is interesting, verse 34, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in shalom. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. So she felt that she was healed, and maybe the physical healing happens, but the other healing has maybe a deeper meaning that comes that when she actually confronts Jesus and tells the truth. She doesn't hide or run away. She comes in fear and trembling to say, I did it. But he, in a positive note, sees that as an act of faith that she is able to do. Yes, Pam.
I wonder if that go in peace also implies that now because she's healed and clean, she can be at peace and be in a community.
Yes, yes, it does. It definitely does. One of the things that's interesting about how Mark tells his whole story, his gospel, is he will start a passage and then there's something that comes in between and then he'll finish the story. Jairus comes, they're walking down to Jairus' house, and then there's another moment that happens. That comes to its conclusion. Then we pick up with Jairus again. You know, all of our TVs and movies have that, right? You shift from one plot to another and back and whatever else. So we're sort of used to that. But why is this happening? Why does Mark tell the story? And one of the things I read about Henry Nouwen, if you know Henry Nouwen, the sort of a theologian, at one point in his life, he was realizing, I'm at my work, but I get all these interruptions. It drives me crazy. And then he realizes the interruptions are my work. The interruptions are my work. And we think about that. You're interrupted by a child, you're cooking supper, but there is something important that needs to happen in that interaction. It happens to me on a Sunday morning. I'm trying to get ready for my sermon, and I get 400 questions about this, that, or the other. Well, no, those are all important questions. And part of any job like that is realizing that the interruptions might be God trying to break through to you when you think you're doing your thing, and your thing is really not his thing. So let those interruptions happen.
It's sort of like be present.
Yes. Yeah.
Jesus very much is present in all his ministry.
Yes.
You know, even though he's on this task, something sidetracks him, and he's very present.
Yeah. Yeah. And he has enough power to go around. He is not going to stop. He will stop. Just like the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? The two who wouldn't stop and the one who would. Jesus is going to stop. Even if it seems like some inconsequential, bleeding woman who's unclean, that nobody wants to be around, he's going to stop. He's going to see what this is about. And that's important.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Sort of goes into the thing, the one who had too much didn't have too much. Jairus' position, he had a lot. The one who had too little,
Especially on screen.
something was given to her. So this is some of that generosity in action, the generosity of God's power with one who had too much and one who had too little. And so all of these, I think, then are acts of mercy. The healings and even to give her something to eat is an act of mercy. It's also to show we're not just talking about some kind of ghost, because ghosts don't eat. Jesus happens to him on the shore, right? He has fish with them after the resurrection to say that this is actually substance that you see. This is not ghost that you see. Any other questions or observations on this healing story? Anybody online in the Zoom world want to chime in on this?
The laying on of hands is the instruction that Jairus gives to Jesus for the healing. And we have that in some of the other gospels about, going out and laying on hands. And it's interesting that you have the instruction come from Jairus, and then immediately following that is the interruption of the laying on of the hand of the woman who's hemorrhaging, touching Jesus. It's now it's also interesting too that when Jesus goes into Jairus's home, we don't hear anything about Jesus laying on his hands. He just takes a hand. It's a taking of the hand and calling to her to get up, little girl, to get up. So I find the hands-on different aspects in this story very interesting. And I think that it's important for us when Jesus lays his hand on us, we're to get up. Not just
right. Well, it's the power of touch, which is
yes.
Yeah, it's the power of touch. That's what incarnation brings. There is flesh that can touch other flesh. The rich becoming poor so that the poor may become rich. And we are enriched by the touch of Christ in that way. So very true. Very true. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I'm glad we could be together and do this. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Rob.